The usual depiction of medieval Mongolian cavalry is of an unruly crowd shooting arrows hither and yon. But the Mongols, like all empires based in the Eurasian steppes, fielded their own heavy horsemen, fearsome warriors who went toe-to-toe with the most heavily armored troops of their era. In this series, we are going to discuss Mongolian heavy cavalry. In part 1, their weapons and equipment, and then in the following weeks, their interactions with cavalry across the world, starting in China with the Jin dynasty, and then working our way west. A lot of discussion that you will see online about Mongolian cavalry, as well as medieval warfare in general, is provided by people who have no familiarity with artistic, textual, and archaeological data that survive from the 13th and 14th centuries. Instead, they'll base expectations, often unconsciously, off of what they have seen in movies, video games, and TV, what feels right to them. Since none of us have experienced a Mongol invasion in a couple centuries, there is always going to be a level of inference with every reconstruction. But the more that those inferences can be supported with direct data from the sources, the better that reconstruction will be. And that is what the discussion in these videos will do, combining as much material from medieval Chinese, Islamic, European, and Mongolian accounts and more in order to understand how the Mongols utilized their heavy cavalry. So, let's talk some heavy horse. First of all, did the Mongols have heavy cavalry? Yes. A wide array of first-hand textual and artistic evidence from across Eurasia support the presence of heavily armored horsemen playing important roles in Mongol armies. And this was not just subject peoples in service of the Khan, but a part of the Mongol army from its inception. Neither was this an innovation by Chinggis Khan. We have evidence for fully armored nomadic cavalry centuries before the Mongol Empire. At least by the 4th century Common Era, heavy cavalry was a feature of armies both in China and the Rouran Khaganate. Though some argue for its existence in the Hunnu state, the evidence for that is not conclusive. The greatest nomadic power before the Chinggisids was the Göktürks, for whom some visual evidence of their heavy cavalry survives. This was not isolated to the eastern steppes either. The 6th century Byzantine military manual, the Strategikon, describes nomadic men and horses protected by iron or felt armors, at least in the front. In form, function, and general equipment, heavy cavalry across most of Eurasia from the 4th century, basically until the widespread adoption of firearms, more or less took the same form, of which we will get into shortly. Where does a steppe nomad get material to make metal armor? Well, you can watch the long video series I just did on that subject and save ourselves some time here. Short answer, they are perfectly capable of acquiring it, just perhaps not in a volume comparable to output from China. The majority of horsemen in this context are not suited up in metal lamellar or mail, but in leather laminar and padded felt armors. These are not styles restricted to the Mongols by any means, but widely used across Eurasia. There is a claim that Mongol horses lacked the strength to be heavy cavalry, a misunderstanding of an argument put forth by John Masson Smith. The sources are quite unequivocal that Mongol horses could be, and were, armored. The eyewitness account of John de Plano Carpini in the 1240s gives us a very detailed description of how Mongol horses were armored. In the 1330s, Ibn Battuta describes how the Delhi Sultanate specifically purchased horses from the Golden Horde on account of their ability to take the weight of armor better than other kinds of horses. What J.M. Smith argued is that between occasions when they were armored up, each horse was given perhaps a week's break in order to distribute the burden. And if there was one thing the Mongol Empire had plenty of, it was horses. The sources indicate that the most common armor, for both horse and rider, were Laminar and Lamellar armors. We'll deal with each of these in turn, starting with leather Laminar. Thanks to Friar Carpina's fact-finding mission in the 1240s, we have an idea of how Mongol Laminar was constructed. He says that Laminar armor began as oxhide. The leather was hardened, boiled according to Marco Polo, cut into strips the width of a hand, and then stacked in 3 to 4 layers. They were then covered in pitch to keep them together. This results in one band of Laminar, and each of these bands were laced together. These were tied into 5 large sections, from the horse's tail to the neck, fastened at the saddle. In artworks, these strips are often painted, and quite brightly too. The horse's head was protected with an iron plate, which tied into the two sections coming up to the neck. This resulted in almost total coverage of the animal, down to its knees and the hock. Similar laminar armor was worn by the rider. Around the torso it formed a sort of shell that fastened at the shoulders and protected the arms and legs in long skirts. In the 13th century, this style of armor did not include hand protection, with the common explanation being that this was to leave the arms mobile enough to handle bows and arrows from horseback, for the bow remained the heavy cavalry's primary weapon. According to William of Rubruck, who observed Mongols in it in the 1250s, this full-length laminar armor was rather awkward for individuals on foot. For a rider on horseback, these long skirts covered the legs down to the boots. Overall, the sources describe this armor as quite effective. European writers like Marco Polo and Thomas the Split refer to it being very strong or even impenetrable, which seems a bit excessive. Iron, acorn-shaped helmets with leather neck protection are commonly described, but we also see visual evidence for these larger, folding laminar visors. They could be worn down to cover the face and neck, or presumably folded up into a brim. There is also a style identified as hatangu del. This is generally taken to refer to a thickly padded coat made of layers of felt, which could also be reinforced with metal plates, comparable to a brigandine or a style of Chinese armor popularly, though anachronistically, called dingjia. These are commonly depicted in artwork showing bright decoration and coloring. The most expensive armor we may expect our rider and horse to wear would be Lamellar. These were small metal plates, iron or steel, laced together into rows. The general shape matched that which we saw in the Laminar. The advantage here was durability and, of course, prestige. Plano Carpini describes it being polished to shine so brightly that you could see your own reflection in it. In the Galician-Volynian Chronicle, when meeting King Bela IV in Bratislava, the troops of Danilo Romanovich appeared dressed in Tartar armor. What precisely that entailed is not specified in the Chronicle, but what is mentioned was that the local Germans could not stop staring at them. One final note regarding equipment. The Mongols did not wear silk undershirts beneath their armor for the purpose of stopping arrows. That's a modern myth, and one I dealt with in another video. The main weapon of the Mongol heavy cavalry was still the bow. The secondary weapon, according to Carpini, that was another bow. Heavy cavalry across most of the medieval world mostly functioned as better armored horse archers. Shock cavalry was not generally a distinctive, separate category here, but a role they took on as necessary. The sources differ in what other equipment they had. In Chinese accounts and in Ilkhanate artworks, shields and spears of different style appear. Su Ting and Peng Daya's account describe short and long spears specifically for the purpose of penetrating heavy armor, as well as different types of shield distinguished by size, use, and unit. The Mongol vanguard being mostly equipped with circular shields strapped over their shoulders. We also have textual depictions of spears with hooks on them, designed to catch an enemy rider and pull him from the saddle. Mongols did not hold the spear in a couched position, but off to the side, clutched by both hands. When not in use, a cord around the spear's head and base kept it slung around the rider's arm and foot. In contrast, some European accounts like Marco Polo and Simon of St. Quentin have Mongol spears as uncommon and shields not used at all. Iron maces are commonly mentioned and axes more rarely, perhaps just as tools. The common style of sword used was a gently curving, single-edged saber of a type common across the Eurasian steppe. Some have argued that Mongol expansion encouraged the adoption of this style across the Islamic world, which had previously preferred straight blades. Written sources mainly indicate that swords were weapons of the Mongol elite, rather than standard kit. Now, it's one thing to list off types of armor, but how much of the Mongol army actually wore it? The sources generally agree that most of the Mongol army was lightly or unarmored, horse archers who kept their distance from the enemy entirely. But what they don't agree on was how many were armored, and likely it varied depending on time and which specific part of the Mongol army our author was dealing with. Not even the Great Khan probably knew what percentage of his army was armored or not. In the account of the Dominican Simon de St. Quentin, who traveled to Baiju Noyan's court in the Caucasus in the 1240s, he described armor as very rare, worn only by commanders, officers, and standard bearers. The elite and the army leadership, essentially. He even suggested that no more than a tenth of the army had armor. But two Song dynasty envoys who traveled to Ögedei's court and wrote at the end of the 1230s state that the Mongol vanguard which numbered 30% of the attack force, was armoured. Since that is a reference just to the van, it would not include other parts of the army that were also armoured. Khan's Keshig, the bodyguard, appeared to have been well equipped and could make up a significant portion of the army when on campaign. It was a 10,000 man unit after all. It's fair to assume that a 10 to 30% range, dependent on circumstances, is a reasonable estimate for how much of the army was armoured. Given that Mongol armies were heavily made up of subject peoples, this number could vary even more. So from sources of the Ilkhanate and its successors, we get an interesting stereotype of the Golden Horde, where they regularly portray the Jochid state having a huge, yet poorly equipped army, apparently in contrast to the Ilkhanate's smaller, but better armed, force. What percentage of Mongols wore metal versus leather armors is unknown. Leather certainly receives greater mention in the sources, but iron is referenced consistently enough that it was being encountered with some regularity by their enemies. Generally, it appears that the armoured units of the Mongol army were always the elite ones. The Keshig, for instance, was mostly staffed by younger sons and brothers of the nobility, commanders. The sources often describe the Khan's involvement in ordering production from blacksmiths, weapon makers, and armourers, yet we see very little indication of these wares going out to the average trooper. Rather, it seems part of the reward for service in the elite units was the output of these industries. We regularly see the sources describe the generosity of the Khan to the nobility, the military elite, and the guard, and part of this seems to have included outfitting them with the material output of Eurasia. In the Ilkhanate, the vizier and historian Rashid al-Din tells us how the initial hurdles for Mongol government had been that the local armourers did not know how to make things in Mongolian style. Once overcome, the Mongols contracted each craftsman to produce a set of armour, bow, weapons, arrows, and so on to deliver to the government every year for its distribution. Supposedly, this didn't work very well. Apparently, no more than 2,000 full sets of weapons were produced every year, until reforms of Ghazan Ilkhan increased this to 10,000, and changed how these were procured. Instead of paying the craftsmen directly, the Ilkhanate would instead give money to the troops, who were then supposed to purchase from the producers. Otherwise, the craftsmen took the money, then sent nothing in return. Whether this system was effective is uncertain. Rashid al-Din's job in his writing was to make the policies of his employer, Ghazan, and himself look as good as possible. Such armor was also simply taken from the storehouses and the battlefield. With the fall of the Song dynasty, much former Song equipment fell into Mongol hands. During his journeys, William of Rubruck saw Mongols wearing male hauberks taken from the Alans, and the Holy Roman Emperor Friedrich II complained that after the victories in Hungary and Poland, the Mongols were wearing armor taken from dead European knights. It's technically possible a Mongol put on a great helm taken from a dead Templar and wore it across Asia, and perhaps even fought in Japan with it. And that's kind of fun. This has been a look at the equipment of the Mongol heavy cavalry. Next time we discuss how they operated on the battlefield, beginning with the wars against the Jin dynasty, so be sure to subscribe, click buttons, and whatever other things YouTube suggests.